Uh, so let's see what we got here. He is white. Alex is black. We have d4, d5, and 4. So already forgetting what the gamut is, but it doesn't matter because black does not take on e4. Decides to push c6. So now, this is actually looking like a Caro-Kann transposition. Really interesting. So normally, whenever you do the Queen's Gambit, instead of pushing e4, you push c4. And the reason for this is because if they take the c4 pawn, you get central control by playing something like 3, and then eventually you can take this one with the bishop. That's the point. Just playing e4 afterwards lets your opponent take your pawn for free because it's not protected by anything, because it's the pawn in front of the king. But he opts not to take it. Plays c6, goes this into a Caro-Kann. White plays 5, knight f6 to block that pawn in front of the king, and then knight. Right, weird. Man, these moves are just getting blitzed out. Okay, I'm all for it. Yep, so h6 to push the bishop out. It's actually, I think that taking this knight is best. Yeah, it is. The reason for that is because it doubles the pawns on the king side, which generally is not so hot, as you obviously want to protect your queen, or your king rather, as much as possible. But he decided to retreat the bishop, which is fine. You know, if black plays something like e6, then this knight is pinned because the bishop will take the queen. That happened. It's knight a6. Just a heads up, you don't want to play your knight to the outside. Playing in chess, and it says a knight on the rim is dim because it only gets to go to like 4 squares. So kind of squares that it controls lower. D takes e4 finally. An extended or an elongated move, I suppose. Should have happened early. Late is what I was trying to say. Okay. Four, 5 attacking the bishop. Bishop, knight g2. Okay. So this is a pretty unconventional position. It's not exactly clear who is better. According to the engine, it's pretty even. Yeah, it's pretty much even. A few things to note, obviously, is that white, if he were to castle kingside, would be pretty exposed because he pushed the f pawn. Usually you don't want to push the f pawn because it puts your king directly into the diagonal. But you know, he decided to go for it, and if he ends up castling queenside, then he'll be a little bit safer. And the moves are flying out now. 5, d takes c5, knight takes c5. Okay, so the position's pretty open right now, at least along the d file, obviously, right? There's no pawns there. The queens are eyeing each other down, but neither player really wants to take the other's for some reason. We have bishop takes e6, and an unconventional f takes e6, which is not as nearly as good as knight takes e6, because of what I was talking about earlier, which is that you're doubling your pawns, actually tripling your pawns in this case, and you're also exposing your king along these diagonals. So if you were to castle, well, I suppose if you were to castle, it wouldn't be that bad, but it's kind of hard because that bishop is stuck, because now he has 3 pawns. Pile. White does end up castling into this dangerous diagonal, but black's dark squared bishop is not really in a position to abuse that. Get queen d7. I suppose black is setting up a queenside castle. And then Knight takes b5. Okay, that is not the best move, but black doesn't see that the queen can actually take. Instead plays a6 in order to apply extra pressure to that knight. Could have just taken it. Now white back to d4 and escapes. So a little bit of unconventional play from black, but I can't say that I hate it. The tripled pawn, most people don't go for it, but sometimes pawn towers can be very dangerous. They control a lot of squares, right? So like right now, he's got f6, d6, d5, d4, not d4, d3, right? He's controlling a lot of squares basically with these pawns along these files. So it can be okay, it just not necessarily best. But black plays rook b8, white plays b4. That pawn's not protected, so black can actually just take it once, but he doesn't. He elects instead to go knight b7, actually blocking his rook from taking that pawn. Very interesting move. White goes h3, giving his king an escape route in case he gets attacked. But engine, white was better off just pushing his pawns, which makes sense. He's not really in a position to get attacked right now. He's on the offensive. Got active pieces. Black's pieces are trapped behind his tripled pawns. So it's white's turn to really make use of this. But he plays a defensive move. I respect that. You don't want to just lose randomly because your opponent does something tricky. And he's still in a winning position, right? Like I said, tripled pawns, diagonal where the king can be attacked. Rook and the bishop are trapped. It's only a matter of time before white can start really pushing pressure. But I mean, what I will say is that a lot of black's pieces are actually being defended right now, so it's not exactly obvious what to do. In fact, black pushes on 5, which is not the best decision. White can just take this, and then black would have to move the knight out of the way somewhere, but that would just leave the king even more open for attack. But instead of taking, white decides to move the knight back, maybe a little bit scared. The position is now completely even if black takes on f4 or takes that queen, then presumably takes on f4 with his pawn. But he doesn't. He continues to push the pawn tower. e6, e6, e5, e4 pawns, all next to each other, all controlling all of these squares. It looks strange and it looks bad, and to be honest, it is. But if white doesn't know how to exploit it, these pawns are controlling a lot of squares. If he keeps pushing them, it isn't obvious what to do. Eventually, when they get far enough, he's just going to start making queen. Isn't exactly obvious what to do. Goes queen b1, and then bishop takes that pawn on b4. What the rook neglected to do, the bishop will now decide that it wants to pick that pawn up. So interestingly, white only has one move that gives him a winning position. Only one move. Every other move is like plus 0.6, plus 0.4, which a pawn is worth 1 point. So it's basically like he's not even up a single pawn. But still, I mean, that would be impressive. Or it would be, better than, but still, f takes on e5 is the only move that gives white an advantage. Breaking up that pawn tower, but grabbing an extra pawn and equalizing material. Also putting pressure on this knight, of course. But instead of doing that, goes 1, black castles, white takes on d7,
What the fuck?
and and Fortunately, I did not mute the player, so I heard that he was quite mad and frustrated about that. Proceedings. Rook f to d8. White moves back to d. So I think it's safe to say white is now in a pretty solid position. Up a queen, down a pawn, but it's still possible to lose. I mean, look, the white king is pretty exposed, even though black doesn't have a queen to attack with. You know, a lot of white's pieces are on the queen side, right? Rook a1, queen on b1, rook on d1, knight on b3. They're not defending the king. Granted, black's pieces aren't attacking the white king either, but if he can somehow find a way, it's still possible. Uh, Now black goes knight c5, potentially moving towards the white king to attack. White plays c3 to the bishop out. Black plays bishop a3. Not exactly doing anything there, but he doesn't have any place to go. Unfortunately, because of the knight c5 move, bishop is a little bit trapped. And now you really start to see why the 3 pawns on the e-file are not so great. It's really blocking up the position. The knight being blocked from going to e6 and e4 because of these. And you know, white's pawns are on all these files where they're free to push up. These are called passed pawns because there's no pawns opposing them. In particular, the pawn on c3. If it can keep pushing, it can eventually promote because there's no pawn stopping it. And white finally does decide to take this pawn on e5 rather. Not the best move, but it doesn't matter. Position's pretty won for white as long as he doesn't make any large mistakes. And unfortunately, black seems to make another mistake in moving his knight out of the way, allowing the white bishop to take this rook on d8 if he so chooses. Uh, Alternative moves could be something like knight takes on c5, and then if the knight takes, then you take with the rook, putting the black king in check. And if the king moves, you rook, so you have to take back, and then the bishop actually take the rook. So just kind of simplifying the position is what this is called. Basically trading off pieces when you're ahead is what you want to. But doesn't even take the rook. He actually decides to go knight f4. So he's developing his pieces towards the black king, perhaps setting up for an attack. Obviously, it's better for you to try to take your opponent's pieces and simplify the position generally. But you know, different people like to play different play styles, so it's understandable. And both players are actually even in time, so this is a game that, depending on how things go, it could come down to time. You know, you never really want to see it come down to time unless you like seeing players move frantically, which can be exciting, but it can definitely be frustrating. So black goes rook f8, attacking this knight. Knight takes on e6. All right, so first we'll observe that black actually moved his rook out of the way of the bishop, and now white moved his knight into the way of black taking it, but doesn't do that. He attacks black bishop, or the white bishop rather, 5. Um, Unfortunately, it would appear, based on the evaluation, that white doesn't even need to worry about that, because knight is of course attacking this black rook. So, you know, could have just taken that, but okay. A lot of these moves can be difficult to see, and especially sometimes the engine doesn't always evaluate what is the most natural moves for human players, especially when they aren't at the grandmaster or master level. You know, for beginner players, the engine can oftentimes be deceiving because the engine suggests moves that just don't make sense naturally. even at the grandmaster level. But it would appear that we are getting some gameplay. So there we go. Bishop takes on c5, checking white king. Knight just takes back, but then the knight takes back. And suddenly, we have a position where white is quite far ahead, because black has a rook and a knight, or white's rook, rook, and bishop. So as you can see, white is up 15 points. Bishops and knights are worth 3 points. Rooks are worth 5. Queens are worth 9. Pawns worth 1. So 15 points is basically 3 rooks up, which is devastating. So we have king g7, rook d6. I assume rook d6 is just setting up for some kind of checkmate. I'm not entirely sure how. Perhaps 7, or not queen b7, queen 7, and then 8 checkmating block. So it can get a little bit complicated, and the last thing you want to do is get a stalemate. These kinds of positions. I've seen it happen many times. Last thing you want to do is stalemate when you're up so much material, especially when you have so much time. You have so much time to think to avoid the stalemate. Worst thing that could happen to you. Black's trying to get a queen. I don't know how effective it will be because there's the rook on the first rank protecting. Was the bishop watching the square? I'll see. I have queen 8. Like I said, presumably setting up for some kind of checkmate, though it's unclear as to how. We have 4 attacking the bishop 1. Now cutting off this pawn from promoting. Perhaps that was black's plan, was to try and promote the pawn. But interestingly, what we now have is a position where if the pawn does get to e2, because the bishop is blocking the rook from attacking that square, the rook can come down to f1, checking the white king, forcing the white king to retreat. And I don't know, maybe something tricky could happen here. Never know. Not get that. We're still on where bishop e1 has been played. And now black is really starting to feel the time pressure. Down a minute and a half. Still has 2.5 minutes left with 5-second increments, so it's unlikely that he will lose on time. But in a position like this, really, when you're down in material, you want to be up in time. Because at the very least, you have a chance of timing out your opponent. Plays a5. Pawn push. That's the name of the game here. If you can somehow equalize material by getting a queen, maybe a miracle could happen. Oh, but white is thinking the same thing. If you're going to try to get a queen, I'm going to try to get a queen. Not often you see the double queen and rook checkmate, but it has happened. Might see it today. What will black do? Really not clear what the best options are. Black can elect to take this rook, but what good does it do? You're just simplifying the position for white. Even if white trades the queen and the rook for the rook and knight of black, he still has a rook and a bishop. Really difficult position for black. He just needs to find something to trick his opponent. That's really the only way that I see black winning here. Low in time does not help. Okay. So king to g6. This is not necessarily the worst move. It's not great because of what just happened. e7, moving the pawn to queening, also putting the king in check. So now, what's black gonna do? He has to somehow block the check or move the king back to where it already was. Now, if he blocks with the knight, doesn't even matter. He can just take. White can take with the rook. Black takes back, and then white gets a queen. Black blocks with rook. White takes with the rook. Black takes with the knight, and now he is protecting the queening square. But then he's trading a knight for a pawn, which is the last important piece. Instead, we actually don't get either of those. We get king h5, which is fairly dangerous because the pawn can promote, and then actually when it promotes to a queen, can check the black king. White does not elect
There's
to do
no
that though.
way he didn't upgrade that shit. I'm crying.
White does not elect to do that though. He elects to um, White elects to play different move. I lost track of it. 5. So it's getting interesting. It is getting interesting. We are actually approaching stalemate territory. This could be exciting. Oh, except never mind. White promoted to a queen, and now the only move black to block, and black timed out. Well, that was an exciting game. It was close for a long time, but fortunately a few led white to victory over black.